Hey guys, tonight we wander back thousands of years, further than your Wi-Fi signal could ever dream of reaching, into a world lit not by LED screens but by torchlight and oil lamps. Imagine yourself stepping through enormous stone gateways into temples that smell faintly of incense, smoke, and maybe just a touch of sweat from the people packed inside. The air is heavy, not just from the heat but from the weight of belief. Belief that every worry a woman felt, every sleepless night, every unexplained trembling of the hands came not from her mind, but from the whims of gods, spirits, and sometimes even her very own womb. You probably won't survive this without a raised eyebrow or two, because history is both fascinating and just a little bit ridiculous. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time down below. I love knowing who's drifting off to history with me and from where. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across the stone floors of ancient Mesopotamian temples, the priests murmuring around you. They whisper that women's trembling, their inexplicable sadness, the tightening in their chest, that's not anxiety, at least not in the way you'd recognize it. No, to them it's a spirit's possession, or perhaps the gods punishing a household. You can almost hear the clinking of bronze bowls as offerings are poured out, wine, bread, oil, to appease divine forces, treatments for a worried mind. Well, they weren't exactly handing out therapy worksheets. Instead, priests prescribed rituals, burning incense under the bed, chanting hymns, even swallowing mixtures of herbs and honey thought to drive away invisible demons. And here's your quirky tidbit of the night. Some clay tablets suggest that women who complained too often of fear or restlessness were told their uterus had literally gone wandering inside their body. Imagine that, your womb packing its little uterine suitcase and drifting toward your lungs, pressing on your chest, making you short of breath. Historians still argue whether that belief was widespread or more symbolic, but either way it stuck around like a bad rumor for centuries. You move forward, time collapsing under your feet, into ancient Egypt. The Nile glitters by moonlight, crocodiles lurking like floating logs, and you notice that healers here had a similar explanation. Women's anxiety, whether it was sudden tears, heart palpitations, or that overwhelming urge to scream, was again blamed on the womb. They even had medical papyri suggesting remedies. Fumigation of the vagina with sweet-smelling herbs to coax the womb back into place, or conversely, foul odors to drive it away from organs it was supposedly crowding. Picture some poor woman lying there while smoke rose beneath her. Definitely not the spa day you had in mind. But here, where the Egyptians get oddly poetic, they tied emotional unrest to cosmic imbalance. A woman's body was a little model of the universe, so if she felt constant dread, it meant the harmony of her body's channels had gone crooked. Treatments included prayers to goddesses like Hathor, guardian of love and joy. You can almost imagine the candles flickering before statues as women clutched amulets. Hopping the carved stone might calm their racing thoughts. Now hop westward in your mind and land in ancient Greece. You're in a cramped chamber where Hippocrates himself scribbles notes on papyrus. He's hailed as the father of medicine, but to you, he seems a little too confident in his theories. He writes that women's fears and melancholy come from humoral imbalance, too much black bile, not enough cheerful blood. His cure, marriage and frequent intimacy. You groan because that's the ancient doctor's equivalent of have you tried turning it off and on again. The underlying idea was that anxiety in women wasn't about inner turmoil. It was about a lack of male companionship. Convenient, huh? Still, Hippocrates wasn't entirely off. He also recommended exercise, balanced diets, and even music to soothe troubled minds. Somewhere in there, you can see a glimpse of sense, that caring for the body and soul together could bring peace. But then he tosses in treatments like bloodletting and purges, and you wince. Ancient medicine loved the drama of bodily fluids being drained. As centuries pass, Roman physicians pick up the same tune. You wander marble corridors, hearing Galen mutter about hysteria, the grand catch-all diagnosis for female anxiety. He thought the uterus was still central, though he polished the theory with a bit more science. Women were told to bathe, to inhale fragrant oils, and once again to marry if single. But Romans also adored herbal remedies, chamomile, valerian, and even opium-infused drinks for calming nerves. Imagine sipping what you thought was a harmless bedtime tea, and suddenly floating 2 feet above the bed in blissful stupor. Yet behind the perfumed oils and herbal poultices, there's silence. Women were rarely asked what they felt inside. Their voices were filtered through priests, fathers, and physicians, so their fear and dread became diagnoses others decided for them. You wonder how many anxious women simply kept quiet, swallowing their dread like bitter medicine. Historians still argue whether anxiety as we describe it today existed in the same form back then. Did women really panic in the night with short breaths and racing hearts, or did cultural expectations shape the very symptoms they reported? Some scholars believe ancient women's anxiety might have often been expressions of grief, oppression, or trauma squeezed into the only language available: illness of the womb, punishment of the gods. As you lie there listening, the temples fade into shadow. You imagine a woman standing in the doorway of an ancient shrine, clutching her chest, whispering that something is wrong inside her. The priest nods knowingly, reaching for incense. She closes her eyes, not because the smoke works, but because for a moment someone acknowledges her suffering. And in that small flicker of care, between control and compassion, the first treatments of anxiety were born. The night deepens, the torches flicker lower, and history begins to pull you toward the next chamber, where Greek doctors will sharpen their theories, mixing logic with superstition in equal measure. You shuffle forward, the scent of burnt incense and ancient oils fatting, and suddenly you're seated on a worn stone bench somewhere in Greece around the 5th century BCE. The air is dry, the horizon broken by olive trees, and just ahead of you is a man scribbling furiously with a reed pen. He looks up, his beard bristling, and you realize you're staring straight into the eyes of Hippocrates himself, the fellow so many later doctors would swear by, sometimes even when they probably shouldn't have. His patients aren't lining up to talk about stress from long commutes or inboxes bursting with unread emails. Instead, they arrive describing what we'd call anxiety: restless nights, chest tightness, sudden bursts of tears, fainting spells, or the feeling of dread that never quite leaves. You lean in, expecting sympathy, but Hippocrates tilts his head and mutters about humors. He's convinced that inside every body swirl 4 essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much of one, and your personality, health, and even sanity tip out of balance. Women's worries. They're a matter of excess black bile or perhaps wandering womb troubles, again with that idea. The anxious woman sitting in front of him might describe trembling hands, racing heartbeats, or breath that comes too fast. But in his notes it becomes hysteria or melancholia, neat labels stamped onto her distress. Here comes the first mainstream fact. Hippocrates genuinely believed anxiety could be treated by balancing the humors through diet, exercise, baths, and sometimes purging or bloodletting. He even recommended listening to soothing music, enjoying nature, or taking long walks to calm the restless spirit. On good days, that sounds like a prescription for wellness that still echoes into modern therapy: exercise, music, mindfulness. On bad days, it involved a lot of leeches and purgatives you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. Now for the quirky tidbit. Hippocrates occasionally prescribed what we'd call a wine cure. Picture him handing a cup of strong red wine to a trembling patient with the calm assurance of a doctor offering modern anti-anxiety medication. The instructions: drink daily, ideally with company, and let the warm flush soothe your nerves. And let's be honest, after 2 goblets of ancient Greek wine, you'd probably feel less anxious too, though you might also feel less coordinated. You can hear the scratching of his stylus as he records another opinion: marriage is the surest cure. Women without husbands, clearly prone to nerves. Women with husbands, Less so, supposedly because intimacy kept the womb occupied and less likely to misbehave. You sigh, rolling your eyes, because it's hard not to notice the convenience of a cure that always circles back to the same patriarchal solution. Historians still argue whether Hippocrates truly believed women's anxiety was purely biological, or whether he wrapped cultural assumptions into his medical theories. Either way, the result was the same. Women were rarely seen as reliable narrators of their own inner lives. Still, you walk through Greek streets and find evidence that not all was doom and gloom. Physicians recommended baths infused with herbs like thyme or mint, and massage with olive oil scented by roses or lavender. Imagine lying back on a marble bench, the warm splash of water on your skin, the faint smell of crushed herbs drifting upward. For a fleeting moment, you think, maybe that could actually work. Maybe some women left those baths less anxious, less burdened, more able to face their daily lives. But as always in history, there's a twist. Anxious women weren't only seen by doctors, they also found themselves at the mercy of oracles and healers. At Delphi, women asked the oracle of Apollo about their restless hearts. Was it a curse? Was it love? Was it the gods' disfavor? Instead of therapy sessions, they received cryptic verses delivered in smoke-filled temples. Picture yourself waiting in line, heart-pounding, only to be handed a riddle that may or may not tell you whether your panic attacks will ever end. Comforting, right? You notice something else. Men's worries weren't always described as hysteria. A soldier trembling before battle might be seen as suffering from fear, but his condition was temporary, even honorable. A woman trembling in her home, that was pathological, an illness of her very sex. This double standard winds its way like ivy across centuries, and you can feel it tightening even here in Greece. At night you walk through the streets, the flicker of oil lamps throwing shadows on whitewashed walls. You hear whispers of women fainting suddenly in public, a condition sometimes called the vapors. In reality, it might have been hyperventilation, anxiety, or even seizures. But to their neighbors, it was yet another sign that the female body was unpredictable, dangerous, and in need of control. You want to shout across time, "She's having a panic attack, not summoning spirits." But your voice, like theirs, is lost in the hum of ancient superstition. One more curious note. Greek healers occasionally used what we now call exposure therapy, encouraging women afraid of crowds or storms to confront those fears gradually, always under guidance. It's startlingly modern in concept, tucked inside a swirl of leeches and womb fumigations. Historians still argue whether these practices were truly effective or simply coincidental, but they do suggest that some physicians glimpsed the mind-body connection centuries before psychology was born. As dawn creeps in, you hear the sound of lyres and the chanting of poets. The Greeks believed music could balance the soul, calming troubled minds. Imagine yourself lying under an olive tree, the melody floating like wind over hills, and for just a moment, the anxious thrum in your chest softens. Maybe this was the most effective treatment of all, not leeches or marriage, but the simple comfort of rhythm and song. You step away from Hippocrates' clinic, past the marketplace where women clutch herbs and amulets, their eyes darting as though pursued by invisible fears. Some will find relief in baths, some in wine, some in whispered prayers to Apollo. Others will simply endure, their anxiety unnamed, wrapped instead in the language of wandering wombs and humoral imbalance. And as the sun sets again, the marble columns casting long shadows, you realize you're moving forward once more. Rome waits ahead, its baths steaming and its physicians preparing yet more potions and promises for anxious minds. The sun shifts, olive groves blur, and suddenly the world around you smells of stone dust and hot bread. You've landed in Rome, the empire's heart, where marble stretches as far as the eye can see and aqueducts carry water like arteries through the city. You drift toward a public bath, steam rising in the air, the murmur of voices echoing under vaulted ceilings. It's a place of relaxation and gossip, of politics and health, and tonight it's where you'll see how anxious women were treated, or perhaps more accurately dismissed, under Roman eyes. The baths themselves are magnificent. Mosaics glitter underfoot. The air tastes faintly of mineral salt, and slaves pour steaming water into pools. Men chatter in one wing, their voices booming, while women gather in another, their laughter softer, mingled with sighs. Here, physicians sometimes walk the halls, prescribing not just hot water for sore muscles, but remedies for troubled minds. Anxiety, though, wasn't a word on their lips. They called it hysteria, melancholy, or suffocatio, the suffocation of the womb pressing upward into the chest. You shake your head. Apparently, the uterus still hadn't gotten over its habit of being blamed for everything. Mainstream fact first. Galen, the towering physician of the Roman world, believed hysteria was caused by retention of seed in women. Yes, that's exactly what you think it means. His prescription: marriage and frequent intimacy. Sound familiar? You've seen this script before in Greece, and you'll see it again later. Anxiety reduced to a sexual imbalance, women's inner turmoil translated into biological deficiency. The Roman baths offered herbs, oils, and opium tinctures. But beneath all that steam, the old patriarchal diagnosis lingered. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some Roman doctors recommended gladiators' blood as a cure for certain nervous ailments. Imagine a trembling woman being offered a cup of dark, metallic-tasting liquid, told it would calm her fears because it contained the spirit of strength. You shudder, and not just from the iron tang you can almost taste in the back of your throat. Historians still argue whether this was symbolic or literal practice, but either way, it makes your modern cup of chamomile tea look a lot more appealing. You walk deeper into the baths, past women reclining on stone benches, attendants rubbing their shoulders with oils scented by myrrh. Some actually do look calmer afterward, their eyes heavy with relaxation. Perhaps for them, the ritual of bathing, being touched, and inhaling those soothing aromas brought a relief that no philosophy text could supply. You can imagine a woman who's been carrying the weight of endless domestic duties finally sighing, sinking into hot water, her anxious thoughts softened by warmth. Maybe this was the Roman version of a mindfulness retreat, except with more marble and fewer Instagram posts. Still, you overhear murmurs. She faints too often, one matron whispers about another. She cries for no reason. Such women might be sent not just to baths but to physicians' chambers, where treatments ranged from herbal concoctions, poppy, henbane, mandrake, to far harsher interventions. Bloodletting remained popular because nothing said calm down to a Roman doctor quite like opening a vein. You picture a woman pale from both fear and blood loss, told she was being cured. In quiet corners, women turned to religion instead. Temples dedicated to Isis or Cybele saw anxious worshippers kneeling, chanting, begging goddesses for relief. The ceremonies were wild, music pounding, incense choking the air, bodies swaying in trance. For some, these ecstatic rituals might have offered what no physician could: catharsis, a way to release pent-up dread in a safe, if smoky, space. Historians still argue whether these rites were more about spiritual experience or emotional therapy, but you can sense how badly women needed someone, anyone, to listen. By torchlight, you walk through Roman streets, hearing the creak of carts, the bark of dogs, the laughter spilling from taverns. And there, at the edge of a cramped alley, you glimpse a woman clutching an amulet tight, eyes darting. She's anxious, though she doesn't have a word for it. To neighbors, she's afflicted by the gods. To doctors, she's ruled by her womb. To herself, she probably just knows she can't breathe sometimes and that she fears the dark pressing in. Her silent suffering, like steam in the baths, rises and disappears into the night sky. And so you realize, even in an empire that built aqueducts spanning miles, invented concrete and charted the heavens, the inner world of anxious women remained uncharted territory. Their fears dissolved into diagnoses made by others, their treatments a blend of comfort and control. Rome gleams around you, its streets alive, but beneath the marble and mosaics lies the same uneasy truth. You can soothe the surface, but the currents below remain restless. The baths grow quieter, the fires burn low, and soon the medieval world waits just beyond the horizon. ready to mix anxiety with sin, visions, and the terrifying suspicion of witchcraft. The Roman torches sputter and fade, and when you blink again, you're standing in the half-light of a medieval street. The world feels narrower now, crooked timber houses leaning toward each other, the air thick with smoke and the smell of damp wool. Horses clatter over cobblestones and bells toll from a church tower. This is a world where faith saturates every corner of life, where illness of the body or of the mind is almost always explained through sin, spirits, or divine punishment. And here in the shadows of stained glass windows, anxious women carry their hidden burdens, sometimes hailed as holy visionaries, sometimes condemned as hysterics, and all too often cast as witches. Mainstream fact first. In medieval Europe, women who displayed signs of what we'd call anxiety, trembling, sudden visions, weeping, compulsive prayers, were often described in spiritual language. They weren't patients so much as sinners, saints, or suspects. Monks and priests diagnosed melancholia or suffocation, but more often than not turned to exorcisms, pilgrimages, or confessions as cures. The line between medicine and religion blurred so thoroughly that even physicians spoke of humors and demons in the same breath. And now, your quirky tidbit. Some texts describe the belief that if a woman's anxiety manifested as uncontrollable weeping, it might mean she was under the influence of elves or fairies. Yes, not only demons or witches, sometimes mischievous spirits of the forest were blamed for sudden tears. Imagine confessing your panic to a priest and being told that woodland creatures had hexed your heart. Historians still argue whether this reflects genuine folk belief or moral tales told by clerics, but it lingers in ballads and whispers that survive to this day. You step into a cathedral, its ceilings soaring like stone forests. Candles flicker, casting halos around statues of saints. Here you see another face of anxiety. Holy women known as mystics who fasted until their bodies shook, prayed until they fainted, and described visions of fire and light. Some of them, like Hildegard of Bingen, were revered, their anxiety reframed as divine ecstasy. To tremble in church, to cry out in visions, could elevate a woman into sainthood. But outside cloisters, the same symptoms might doom her as a witch. You shuffle further, your feet catching on uneven cobbles, and hear the muffled cries of a woman being led to trial. Her neighbors reported strange behavior, night terrors, nervous fits, maybe just too many complaints of dread. In the fevered climate of the age, these could be proof of demonic possession. You can almost hear the accusations piling up. She cursed my cow, she shrieked in the night. She wandered alone, trembling. For anxious women, fear itself became evidence against them. And yet, in quieter corners, monasteries and convents experimented with remedies that sound gentler. Herbal gardens grew valerian, chamomile, and St. John's wort. Monks wrote recipe books describing how to brew teas for melancholy hearts and nervous spirits. Imagine a nun leaning over a copper pot, steam rising as she stirs herbs meant to calm a restless sister. The irony isn't lost on you. Sometimes the same church that condemned women's anxiety also offered the closest thing to care. You duck into a small village house, the hearth smoke stinging your eyes. A midwife listens to a woman's racing fears, placing a hand on her chest. She recommends carrying a pouch of dried lavender or whispering protective charms at night. It's folk medicine, yes, but also a kind of proto-therapy, an acknowledgement that fear needs soothing, not punishment. Historians still argue whether such folk healers were true medical practitioners or simply women filling the gaps left by physicians, but their role in tending anxious souls is undeniable. The streets darken, lanterns swinging. You hear gossip weaving through the night, anxious women described as cursed, bewitched, or simply fragile. Some were pitied, some were mocked, and some disappeared into convents or prisons. Anxiety was never just a private struggle. It was public, politicized, and endlessly judged. And so, walking away from the medieval square, you feel the dual weight of control and care pressing on your shoulders. On one hand, the church offered comfort, herbs, prayers, rituals. On the other, it wielded suspicion and punishment, branding women's fears as dangerous or unholy. Between saints, visions, and witches' trials, women's anxiety in the medieval world became a stage upon which society played out its deepest fears of disorder, the unknown, and female voices that trembled too loudly. The bells toll again, louder now, and as the sound fades, so does the medieval village, pulling you toward cloisters where remedies, chains, and whispered prayers await in the next chapter of this restless history. The church bells fade, their echoes folding into silence, and you find yourself inside the cloistered walls of a medieval monastery. The air is cooler here, heavy with the scent of beeswax and rosemary from the herb garden just beyond the stone archway. You hear the distant chanting of monks, their voices weaving through the corridors like a soft background hum. This is where medicine, religion, and daily life blur into one seamless whole. And for anxious women, that blurring could mean the difference between comfort and confinement. Mainstream fact first. Monasteries were among the few places in medieval Europe where medical knowledge was preserved and practiced. Monks copied ancient texts, tended gardens filled with medicinal plants, and provided remedies for both body and spirit. If a woman was described as restless, fearful, or consumed with melancholia, she might be given teas brewed from valerian root or infusions of chamomile and balm. The Benedictine Abbess Hildegard of Bingen herself recommended fennel and licorice for troubled hearts. In theory, monasteries could be havens for anxious souls. But here's your quirky tidbit. Some medieval recipes for treating women's nervous fits involved binding amulets filled with herbs to their bodies, sometimes on the chest, sometimes around the waist, and occasionally, quite awkwardly, around the neck. One text even suggested stitching words of scripture onto fabric and wearing it beneath the gown, as though anxiety could be tricked into submission by fashion accessories. Historians still argue whether these charms were meant as placebo comfort, genuine medicine, or simply spiritual insurance, but you can imagine how clunky and itchy they must have been. You walk down a stone hallway into the infirmary, where the boundaries between healing and restraint reveal themselves most clearly. One woman lies in a small bed, pale and trembling, a nun pressing a cloth soaked in lavender oil to her forehead. Another is not so fortunate. She sits in the corner, her wrists bound loosely with rope to prevent what monks describe as wild fits. Anxiety, after all, was often mistaken for possession or madness, and monasteries did not always have the gentlest responses. Between the garden and the chains, you see the two sides of monastic care, compassion and control. It's not just monks at work here. Nuns, especially in convent infirmaries, played key roles as healers. You picture a sister kneeling beside an anxious woman, whispering prayers while handing her a potion brewed with valerian, hops, or even poppy syrup. Some convents allowed women with nervous conditions to live within their walls permanently, calling it charity. To some, this was safety. To others, it was lifelong imprisonment. Historians still argue whether these cloisters were more sanctuary or asylum, but for women of the time, they often had no better options. You wander into the herb garden, the plants brushing your fingertips as you pass. Mint, sage, hyssop, lavender, fragrant companions that offered small comfort against big fears. There's a strange peace here, though you can't ignore the faint echo of sobs from behind cloistered walls. Anxiety in this world isn't called anxiety. It's nervous fever, vapors, melancholia, or spiritual weakness. And while the remedies of herbs and prayer might soothe some, others were labeled dangerous, their fears treated as rebellion against God himself. Beyond the monastery, village healers echoed these treatments with folk variations. You pass through a cottage and see a wise woman brewing tea, telling an anxious girl to carry St. John's wort in her pocket for courage. Sometimes she whispers protective charms or sprinkles salt across the threshold to keep away spirits said to cause panic. These rituals weren't recognized by official medicine, but for many, they offered comfort when nothing else could. You can't help but think that in these whispered words and herbal satchels, There was a kind of proto-therapy, a recognition that fear needed soothing, even if the methods now seem quaint. But not all anxious women were lucky enough to find gardens and kind whispers. You hear the heavy thud of an iron bolt, and suddenly you're in a darker corner of medieval care, cells where women were restrained, sometimes chained to prevent harm. Their cries echoed off stone walls, dismissed as demonic rather than understood as panic. For them, monasteries were not havens at all, but prisons wearing the mask of holy charity. You pause here, thinking about how many lives slipped between the cracks of compassion and punishment. One anxious woman might receive lavender and a prayer, another might receive chains. Both lived under the same roof. And this, you realize, is the essence of history's treatment of women's anxiety, always suspended between control and care, tenderness and tyranny. The chants rise again in the distance, softer this time, carrying you onward. Outside the monastery walls, fires flicker in the night, and suspicion thickens in the air. Soon, those anxious cries and restless behaviors will no longer be seen as mere illness. They will become fuel for witch hunts, trials, and flames that burn far hotter than any monastery hearth. The monastery walls fall behind you, and as you step into the wider world of late medieval and early modern Europe, the tone shifts dramatically. The garden scents of lavender and chamomile fade into the acrid smoke of torches and hearths. Bells no longer call to prayer alone. They now toll warnings, and whispers about witches swirl in every market square. Women's anxiety, once treated with herbs and psalms, now finds itself entangled in a darker narrative. Fear, suspicion, and the brutal machinery of witch hunts. Anxious women, those who trembled, wept too often, or behaved in ways that unsettled their neighbors, became vulnerable in ways both predictable and tragic. The same trembling hands that might once have been soothed with a cup of valerian tea were now pointed out in court as evidence of consorting with the devil. The world had entered an era where female fear was no longer a personal struggle or even a medical problem. It was a threat to the moral order of Christendom. Let's anchor in the facts first. During the height of the witch hunts, from the 15th through 17th centuries, Europe executed tens of thousands of people accused of witchcraft, overwhelmingly women. Symptoms that modern eyes would instantly recognize as anxiety, panic attacks, shaking, fainting spells, sleeplessness, intrusive thoughts, were instead interpreted as signs of possession or pacts with Satan. Why else, the reasoning went, would a woman tremble at prayer or wake screaming in the night if not for demonic influence? To understand this, imagine yourself standing in a dim village hall, the air thick with the murmurs of townsfolk. At the center is a pale, nervous woman, her eyes darting, her body fidgeting as she faces accusations. Perhaps she has been grieving, perhaps her mind is fragile, perhaps her nights are tormented by panic. But none of these words exist in the lexicon of her judges. Instead, her anxiety becomes fits or unnatural agitation, interpreted not as illness but as guilt. Fear itself is seen as proof of crime. Enter the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, published in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer. This text, part legal manual and part fever dream, became the handbook for identifying, prosecuting, and punishing witches. Its pages brim with misogyny, framing women as naturally weak, prone to melancholy, and therefore especially vulnerable to Satan's influence. Kramer and his peers argued that women's fears, tears, and mental unrest were not random, but evidence of their susceptibility to the devil. Anxiety, in this logic, became not a symptom but a sin. The trembling widow, the fainting maiden, the restless mother, all were prime candidates for suspicion. If they sought remedies in herbs or charms, that too was seen as witchcraft. Thus, treatments for women's distress became entangled with accusations, and what once brought comfort now drew suspicion. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some records suggest that women accused of witchcraft were forced to undergo tests designed to provoke or reveal hidden agitation. They might be pricked with needles to see if they reacted. If not, it was proof of demonic protection. or they were made to recite prayers while watched closely for signs of trembling. Ironically, the very symptoms of anxiety, sweating, stumbling, forgetting words under pressure, sealed their fate. Anxiety didn't just fail to save them, it damned them. The tragedy deepens when we recognize that these witch hunts were themselves fueled by collective anxiety. Communities racked by famine, disease, or war sought scapegoats, and women who displayed visible nervousness became easy targets. A woman packing at night, whispering prayers under her breath, or clutching talismans against her fears, could be reimagined as secretly conspiring with dark forces. Picture a small farming village struck by crop failure. The harvest rots in the fields, children cry from hunger, and the community simmers with desperation. In such a climate, when a woman known for her anxious muttering walks by, her behavior no longer seems harmless. Her restless hands and worried expression take on sinister interpretations. She cursed our fields. She prayed against us. Her personal fears are transmuted into communal blame. It's a cruel irony. Women's anxiety, which in earlier times had been treated with herbs and charms, now became both the cause and the evidence of evil. Instead of soothing them, the community fed on their distress, consuming it in the fires of accusation. Step into a courtroom of the era, and you see how trials themselves were engineered to heighten anxiety. The accused woman, already terrified, faced interrogation by stern judges and hostile neighbors. The questions were repetitive, confusing, designed to trip her into contradictions. Some courts even kept women awake for days, knowing that exhaustion and panic would cause them to stumble, cry, or confess. To modern eyes, this reads like a psychological horror scene. The trial magnified a woman's fears, then rebranded her reactions as confirmation of guilt. Tears were interpreted as false, trembling as proof, silence as stubbornness, words as deception. There was no way to win. Anxiety was both symptom and crime, both cause and consequence. Beyond the courtroom words, the body itself was inspected as evidence. Women accused of witchcraft were searched for witches' marks, blemishes, scars, or even moles said to be signs of demonic contact. Imagine the sheer anxiety of being stripped and examined under the gaze of hostile neighbors. Any flinch or blush became incriminating. The process was not just humiliating, it weaponized women's natural nervousness against them. There are chilling accounts of women fainting during such searches. Rather than being recognized as panic attacks, these collapses were treated as supernatural phenomena. "See how she swoons when the devil's mark is touched," whispered the crowd. Anxiety, once again, was misread as evidence of otherworldly corruption. The darkest image, of course, is the stake. Anxious women, who might once have been given chamomile for comfort, now faced ropes, kindling, and flames. Their trembling became a public spectacle, their cries the soundtrack of communal purification. You can almost hear the crowd shouting as the fire roars, their own fears momentarily quelled by watching another's destruction. And yet, there's a haunting truth. The witch hunts were not only acts of violence, but rituals of shared anxiety. The community, too afraid of famine, plague, or war, poured its nervous energy into these prosecutions. Women's personal anxiety fed into collective anxiety, creating a cycle where fear begot fear until it consumed lives wholesale. Amidst this darkness, there are whispers of resistance. Some midwives and healers continued to offer remedies in secret, tending to anxious women with herbs and quiet prayers despite the risks. Others recorded their fears in diaries or confessions, leaving behind testimonies of their torment that now allow us glimpses of their inner worlds. These fragments remind us that even in the age of flames, women sought ways to survive their fear and to comfort each other. As you walk away from the imagined smoke of a witch trial, the air feels heavier. Anxiety has transformed from a personal affliction into a communal crime, from trembling hands into cursed ones. What had once been whispered as weakness was now shouted as witchcraft, and the consequences were fatal. You realize that this chapter in history isn't just about misunderstanding women's mental health. It's about the lethal consequences of fear misinterpreted and power misapplied. Women's anxiety wasn't simply untreated, it was criminalized, demonized, and burned. But history doesn't end here. The Enlightenment waits beyond the flames, promising new languages for illness, new treatments, and new prisons of their own. The witch hunts may have ended, but the anxious woman's struggle for understanding was far from over. Smoke clears, but the echo of cries lingers in your ears as you step forward into the Renaissance, that bright and gilded age people often imagine as filled with art, science, and rebirth. Yet for anxious women, the Renaissance was not necessarily a gentle dawn. Yes, paintings were luminous, cathedrals reached skyward, and wealthy patrons debated philosophy, but behind the grand facades, the treatments for female anxiety often meant blades, leeches, and remedies that sound more like punishments than care. If you've ever had a bad day at the doctor, you'll be relieved to know that at least no one pulled out a bowl and a sharp knife to balance your humors. Because here, in this era, that was the standard. You trail into the tiled chambers of Renaissance apothecaries, places that smell of rosemary, dried rose petals, and vinegar. Wooden shelves sag with jars of powders, roots, and oils. Behind the counter, a physician in long robes and a stiff ruff explains that a woman's trembling hands, her panic, her sleepless muttering, are the result of an imbalance, too much black bile or perhaps an excess of phlegm clogging her system. The Renaissance was still tethered to the ancient Greek theory of humors, four fluids ruling the body and by extension, the mind. Anxiety was rarely seen as a psychological condition. It was the overflow or deficit of invisible substances sloshing inside. The cure: drain, purge, or heat until balance returned. Imagine you're seated in one of these chambers, the physician bustling about with practiced authority. He ties a strip of cloth around your arm, sharpens his blade, and sets a bowl beneath your skin. The blood drips steadily, each drop believed to release the demons of fear. For an anxious woman, the irony was sharp. Her racing heart and shallow breathing might be symptoms of panic, but the treatment only left her weaker, paler, and more prone to fainting, the very reactions that reinforced the sense she was ill. Historians still argue whether such bloodletting ever provided placebo relief or whether it was purely harmful. One thing is certain: the experience was terrifying, and terror is not the best cure for terror. Beyond bloodletting, other remedies abounded. Physicians prescribed purgatives, herbal brews meant to induce vomiting or diarrhea, to clear out the humors. Some women were instructed to sweat in heated chambers, swaddled in blankets until they nearly collapsed. Others were sent into perfumed baths, which at least sound more pleasant, though the reasoning was not to calm the mind, but to soften the body so medicines could penetrate more easily. Anxiety became a physical inconvenience to be managed with drastic interventions. You can almost hear a woman whispering in exhaustion after such a session. "Doctor, I came for relief, but I only feel more faint." At the same time, Renaissance culture complicated matters. Women's anxiety could sometimes be reframed as poetic melancholy. Noblewomen of courts, reclining in ornate chambers, might be excused for their nerves as part of their delicate refinement. To sigh heavily, to feign its strong emotions, to be stricken with nerves at the sight of tragedy, it all suited the image of a cultured lady. Anxiety, in this setting, was a performance as much as a suffering. But for poorer women, the same symptoms led straight to harsher treatments. You see the double standard at play. A duchess's trembling was artistic. A washerwoman's trembling was pathological. Here's a curious tidbit. In some Renaissance households, women were advised to inhale the smoke of burning herbs such as sage or rue to calm their nerves. They would sit with cloth hoods over their heads, steam rising around their flushed faces, breathing deeply of bitter fumes. Some records even describe women instructed to sniff musk or ambergris, animal-derived scents so pungent they could make the strongest person gag. Whether this soothed anxiety or simply distracted the sufferer by overwhelming the senses is anyone's guess. But the image of anxious women sitting in clouds of strange smoke is striking. The Renaissance also brought a strange marriage between medicine and astrology. Doctors consulted the stars before prescribing remedies, claiming that planetary alignments influenced humors and moods. An anxious woman might be told her fears were worsened by Saturn's melancholy influence or the waning of the moon. Treatments, therefore, were scheduled according to celestial charts. Imagine sitting nervously as a physician flips through star maps before deciding when to open your veins for bloodletting. The anxiety of waiting for Saturn to behave could rival the anxiety one sought to cure. Yet amid these questionable practices, threads of compassion glimmer. Some Renaissance physicians genuinely tried to soothe women with gentler treatments. Aromatic gardens where patients walked among lavender and roses, soft music performed on lutes to calm restless thoughts, or the prescription of rest in quiet countryside retreats. Wealthy women might be sent to villas overlooking vineyards, instructed to take in fresh air, sip watered wine, and distract themselves with embroidery. These treatments, while limited, at least recognized that anxiety required more than blades and bowls. Still, the undertone of control never left. Women were rarely asked what they felt, only told what they should do. Their anxiety was cataloged in men's books, explained by men's theories, treated with men's methods. A woman's own voice in describing her panic mattered little compared to the physician's interpretation. Anxiety was not yet a dialogue, it was a diagnosis imposed. And while the Renaissance lifted art and philosophy into dazzling heights, it kept women tethered to the same suspicion that had haunted them during the witch hunts. A woman who grew too nervous, too agitated, too difficult to treat might still find herself whispered about in darker terms. The flames of witch trials did not disappear overnight. In fact, in certain corners of Europe, they burned alongside the new medical theories, creating a terrifying overlap. Imagine being treated with leeches one month and accused of witchcraft the next when your anxiety didn't improve. Relief was elusive, suspicion constant. Walking through this age, you notice how treatments mirrored society's fascination with balance and spectacle. Bloodletting was a ritual of release, purging a theatrical cleansing. Perfumed baths turned suffering into performance. Astrology turned panic into cosmic drama. Women's anxiety was never allowed to simply exist as a human experience. It had to be dressed up in cosmic, medical, or moral clothing. Anxiety was always something to fix, to purge, to name, but never to listen to. As the Renaissance fades into the early modern period, you sense the stage shifting again. Physicians will soon trade star charts for microscopes, and sparks of electricity will hum in laboratories where new cures are promised. But for now, in the tiled rooms with their jars of herbs and polished bowls, anxious women continue to tremble under the weight of treatments that bleed them dry. And as you step away, you can't help but think. If a woman sought help for her fears, she often left weaker than when she came. The shadows of the witch hunts recede, though they never vanish entirely, and you drift into the polished courts and manor houses of the 17th century. Here, the anxious woman is no longer automatically suspected of witchcraft, at least, not if she belongs to the upper ranks of society. Instead, anxiety takes on a curious double life. Among the nobility, it is rebranded as refinement, delicacy, or nervous disorder, while for the poor, it remains a sign of weakness, madness, or sin. You can almost hear the clatter of carriage wheels on cobblestones as you pass into this new world, where women's tremors and sighs echo against gilded ceilings rather than courtroom rafters. Step into the drawing room of a wealthy household, and you find women reclining on upholstered chairs, fanning themselves, complaining of palpitations, swoons, or fits of nerves. The language of illness shifts. No longer merely humors gone astray, anxiety is now part of a fashionable vocabulary. To be nervous is, in some circles, a marker of social status, proof that you live a life delicate enough to be troubled by emotions rather than by hunger. This strange twist makes anxiety at once more visible and more invisible, paraded in salons as conversation fodder yet stripped of its true distress. If you faint in the middle of a poetry reading, you are admired for your sensitivity, not pitied for your suffering. But don't be fooled by the velvet drapes and powdered wigs. Treatments still follow the old rituals of balance and purgation. Bloodletting remains popular, though now performed in more private chambers, with gilt bowls catching the crimson evidence of imbalance. Leeches still crawl from glass jars onto pale wrists, their work disguised by perfumed handkerchiefs and polite conversation. Physicians stride through these spaces with the confidence of men who believe the body is a machine that can be recalibrated by draining and doozing. Anxiety is treated not as a voice to be listened to, but as a fault line to be patched over with lancets, tinctures, and stern advice. Imagine being a noblewoman in this century, caught between luxury and confinement. You are told that your nerves require rest, yet rest means being confined indoors, reading censored books, or embroidering endlessly under candlelight. Your every gesture is monitored. If you are too lively, you are indecorous. If you are too withdrawn, you are melancholic. Anxiety thrives in this cage of expectations, a silent companion that grows stronger in the absence of true freedom. Historians still argue whether these so-called nervous disorders were a way for women to carve out small spaces of autonomy, refusing certain duties by claiming illness, or whether they simply reinforced male control. Perhaps the truth lies in the middle. Women lived their anxiety both as suffering and as subtle resistance. For those outside the courts, the story was grimmer. In villages and towns, women who showed the same trembling or sleeplessness received little sympathy. A noblewoman's fainting spell was poetry. A milkmaid's panic attack was madness. Treatments for the poor were often harsher. Confinement in rudimentary hospitals, the application of blistering agents to draw out illness, or the endless recitation of prayers imposed by local clergy. Anxiety in this context remained a stigma, a personal failing rather than a fashionable condition. The double standard hardened like plaster over cracked walls. And yet, the 17th century also birthed new vocabularies for nervousness. Physicians began writing extensively about the nerves, the delicate threads thought to carry sensation through the body. Anxiety, once explained by wandering wombs or black bile, now found a new seat in this invisible system. Doctors speculated that nerves could be overstimulated, weakened, or tangled, leading to trembling, restlessness, and sleepless nights. The language may have been crude, but it edged closer to describing real physiology. A woman's shaking hands were no longer always blamed on demons or humors. They might now be framed as the consequence of overstrained nerves. You can feel the shift, a tiny step toward modernity, though still wrapped in superstition. A quirky detail from this era: some women were prescribed chocolate to calm their nerves. Imported from the New World and mixed with sugar and spices, it was both exotic luxury and medicine. Imagine sipping a thick, sweet drink in a porcelain cup, told that its warmth would steady your nerves, even as the caffeine buzzed beneath your anxiety. Other remedies included powdered pearls, considered to strengthen the heart, and opium tinctures slipped into wine. You begin to realize that 17th century medicine was as much theater as therapy, designed to impress patients with rarity and extravagance as much as to soothe them. Yet for all the pearls and chocolate, darker treatments persisted. Some physicians prescribed isolation, sending women away from their households to rural retreats where they were cut off from familiar comforts. The theory was that anxiety was contagious, that nervous women might influence one another if gathered in the same rooms. Imagine the loneliness of being sent away, your letters censored, your days regimented by caretakers who measured your food and sleep. Anxiety feeds on isolation, and so the cure often worsened the condition. Meanwhile, the social fabric of Europe was riddled with its own anxieties. Wars raged, economies shifted, plagues reappeared, and religious tensions boiled. Just as in the witch hunts, women's visible anxiety mirrored the nervous state of their societies. A noblewoman trembling at court was both a private patient and a public symbol. Her nerves stood in for the instability of the world around her. Communities projected their fears onto these frail figures, sometimes elevating them as sensitive barometers of culture, sometimes dismissing them as weak vessels. Anxiety became a metaphor as much as an illness, woven into sermons, poems, and plays. The theater itself reveled in the image of the anxious woman. On stage, heroines fainted dramatically, wrung their hands, or collapsed in grief, and audiences responded with admiration. Women in real life found themselves expected to echo these performances, to embody a certain fragile elegance. But beneath the performance, the suffering was real. Sleepless nights, racing thoughts, the heavy dread that crept in without explanation. You can almost hear a 17th century woman whispering to herself, "They call me delicate, but I feel only trapped." By the end of the century, medical debates about nerves gained momentum. Some doctors argued that nervous disorders were the price of civilization itself, that educated, sensitive people were more prone to such conditions than peasants. Others countered that nerves were universal, that anyone could be undone by too much stress. The arguments swirled in medical journals, but the patients, especially women, were left in the middle, subjected to treatments that often blurred care and control. And so, as you leave this century behind, you see clearly the paradox it created. Anxiety was no longer purely criminalized, as in the witch trials, nor purely brutalized, as in the crude, bleeding bowls of the Renaissance. It had become a fashionable condition, a marker of refinement in some circles, yet still a stigma in others. Women lived suspended between privilege and punishment, their nerves both cherished and disciplined. The 17th century did not heal women's anxiety. It dressed it up in lace and velvet, masking its cries beneath layers of status, superstition, and social performance. The 18th century greets you with powdered wigs, silk gowns rustling across parquet floors, and the swelling music of harpsichords echoing in candlelit salons. It is a century of enlightenment and revolution, of rational inquiry on one hand and deep-seated superstition on the other. Anxiety, once branded as weakness or witchcraft, now enters a new arena. It becomes intellectualized, medicalized, and aestheticized. To suffer from nerves in this era is to inhabit a peculiar space between affliction and fashion. The anxious woman of the 18th century lives in a society that both pities and romanticizes her, treating her symptoms as evidence of refinement, sensibility, and a delicate soul in tune with the world's vibrations. Walk through a fashionable London townhouse or a Parisian salon, and you will encounter the word nervous everywhere. Nervous complaints, nervous disorders, nervous constitutions. These phrases infiltrate medical texts, poetry, diaries, and gossip. Physicians expand upon 17th century theories of the nervous system, believing it to be the most delicate and crucial network of the human body. Anxiety is no longer confined to the womb or the humors. It is a matter of overstimulated nerves, of a body too finely strung, like a harp whose strings tremble at the slightest touch. This metaphor captures the imagination of both doctors and poets, making nervous illness a badge of sensibility among the educated and wealthy. But for the women who live it, the condition is far from poetic. Imagine a woman waking in the middle of the night, her chest tight, her thoughts racing, her body trembling as though gripped by invisible hands. By morning, she must dress in satin, paint her cheeks with rouge, and attend to her role in polite society. To admit weakness is risky, but to claim nerves is permissible. It casts her as refined, sensitive, even virtuous. Thus, anxiety becomes a language of survival, a way to express suffering without straying outside the narrow bounds of acceptability. The 18th century introduces new treatments for these nervous complaints, some of them gentler than the brutal bleedings of earlier ages. Physicians recommend fresh air, carriage rides, mineral baths, and time in the countryside. Walking in gardens, listening to soft music, or drinking calming infusions of chamomile and valerian root are prescribed alongside the more dangerous opium tinctures that remain in circulation. Opium, sold as laudanum, becomes a common household remedy, touted as both painkiller and nerve soother. Women consume it dissolved in wine, sometimes without realizing its addictive grip, finding temporary relief in its warm haze. The very medicine that calms their panic also tightens its hold with each dose, creating cycles of dependence that echo through diaries and letters of the time. In this world of refinement, women's anxiety intertwines with the cultural movement of sensibility. To be sensitive, to feel deeply, is praised as moral and artistic. Women who swoon at poetry readings, weep at novels, or tremble at sad music are admired as paragons of virtue. Yet beneath this admiration lurks a cage. Sensibility allows women to display their emotions, but only in ways that serve cultural ideals of femininity. A woman who is too nervous, too unruly, too openly anxious risks losing her status. The line between fashionable nerves and dangerous madness is razor thin. Meanwhile, for women outside the salons, maids, shopkeepers, laborers, the picture remains harsher. Nervous disorders are framed as the privilege of the wealthy, yet anxiety touches every life. The poor are not granted the luxury of sensibility. Their trembling is pathologized or ignored. When a maid collapses from panic, she is accused of laziness. When a noblewoman swoons, she is admired for her refinement. This double standard hardens further, shaping a cultural divide where class dictates whether anxiety is treated as illness, weakness, or art. Philosophers and physicians alike weigh in on the question of nerves. Some argue that modern civilization itself is to blame, that urban living, constant social interaction, and the pressure of manners fray the nervous system. Others insist that women, by nature, are more susceptible due to their delicate constitutions. Anxiety thus becomes entangled in debates about gender, class, and progress. The idea emerges that nervousness is a disease of refinement, that those who feel most acutely are also those most endangered by their own sensitivity. It is a flattering yet punishing diagnosis, one that elevates and confines women at the same time. In this century, literature plays a powerful role in shaping the image of the anxious woman. Novels brim with heroines who faint, weep, and tremble, their emotions flowing across pages in torrents of tears and sighs. Audiences consume these stories eagerly, and real women are expected to model themselves after these fictional figures. A woman's anxiety becomes not only an internal struggle, but also a performance, one that must fit the scripts of sensibility. Imagine the weight of living under such expectations, your private dread transformed into public theater, your suffering both amplified and dismissed. And yet, within these constraints, women carve out quiet spaces of resistance. Some use nervous illness as a way to avoid unwanted duties, retreating from social or domestic obligations by claiming frailty. Others write about their anxiety in letters or diaries, crafting private narratives that reveal more complexity than society allows. These personal accounts show the dual nature of 18th century anxiety, both a prison and a possibility, both silenced and spoken in coded ways. The remedies of the age reflect its contradictions. Physicians prescribe horseback riding for exercise, yet warn against excessive excitement. They encourage travel to seaside resorts like Bath, where mineral waters promise to soothe the nerves, yet also advocate restraint and moderation in all pleasures. Women are urged to read, but not too much, for too much intellectual exertion might overstimulate their fragile systems. They are told to engage in society, but not excessively, lest they exhaust themselves. The result is a paradoxical regime of moderation that leaves women with little room to act freely. One peculiar fashion emerges: the use of electrical machines for nervous complaints. In the latter half of the century, experiments with electricity lead some physicians to believe that small shocks might restore balance to the nervous system. Imagine sitting in a salon while a physician turns a crank, sending sparks through your fingers, promising to realign your trembling body with the hidden forces of nature. Anxiety becomes not only a medical condition, but also a site of experimentation, where science, spectacle, and desperation intersect. As revolutions stir in America and France, the collective anxiety of societies mirrors the private anxieties of women. The rhetoric of nerves becomes a way to speak about instability, fragility, and the costs of progress. Political pamphlets describe nations as nervous systems on the brink of collapse, echoing the metaphors used for anxious women. The individual body and the social body are intertwined, each trembling in response to pressures too great to bear. By the century's end, the anxious woman is firmly established as both a cultural icon and a medical patient. She is praised for her sensibility, pitied for her frailty, and scrutinized by physicians who debate whether her condition arises from her body, her mind, or her society. Treatments remain inconsistent, swinging between kindness and cruelty, moderation and excess. Yet the discourse around nerves has shifted profoundly. Anxiety is no longer the unspeakable curse of demons or witchcraft. It is now part of the vocabulary of modernity, a recognized, if misunderstood, aspect of human life. And so, as the 18th century closes its gilded doors, you glimpse a paradoxical legacy. Anxiety has become both visible and invisible, both honored and dismissed. The anxious woman walks the candlelit corridors of her age carrying a burden dressed up as elegance, her suffering masked as sensibility, her distress framed as refinement. Beneath the silk and powdered hair, beneath the opium and the fainting couches, the old truths remain. Her heart pounds, her breath shortens, her thoughts race. She is at once admired and unseen, her anxiety both a mirror of her world and a reality that no metaphor can fully contain. You step into the 19th century, a world where soot-blackened factories hum with steam, where locomotives roar across landscapes once walked in silence, and where the very pace of life has accelerated beyond recognition. This is the century of industry, empire, and upheaval, and it is also the century when anxiety, especially women's anxiety, takes on new meanings, new diagnoses, and new treatments. The Enlightenment's fascination with sparks and nerves has not disappeared, but it has been reshaped by industrialization, urbanization, and the rise of modern psychiatry. What was once framed as delicate nerves or magnetic fluids now becomes the subject of medical textbooks, asylum records, and moral treatises. Women's bodies and minds are no longer simply stages for spectacle. They are laboratories of progress, battlegrounds for control, and canvases upon which society projects its deepest fears about modernity. Imagine the drawing rooms of Victorian London. The lamps glow faintly through coal smoke, carriages clatter along cobblestone streets. Inside, a woman collapses onto a fainting couch, hand pressed against her corseted chest, declaring herself overcome by nerves. The fainting couch itself becomes a cultural icon, a piece of furniture designed for women whose anxiety is expressed through collapse. To be nervous in this setting is not unusual. It is expected, even theatrical. But the meanings attached to this anxiety are shifting. Doctors, now increasingly professionalized, rush to categorize, diagnose, and prescribe. They reach for new words: neurasthenia, hysteria, melancholia. Anxiety, once a vague trembling, now belongs to a growing taxonomy of mental disorders. The word hysteria dominates the century. Rooted in the ancient idea of the wandering womb, it becomes a catch-all diagnosis for women who display emotional distress, nervousness, or behavior that challenges social norms. A woman who is too anxious, too restless, too resistant might be declared hysterical and subjected to treatments ranging from rest cures to institutionalization. The infamous rest cure, popularized by physician Silas Weir Mitchell, involves confining women to bed, forbidding them from reading, writing, or engaging in intellectual activity. They are force-fed milk, rubbed with massage, and denied stimulation, on the theory that overwork of the mind has exhausted their nerves. For countless women, including the writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman, this treatment becomes not a cure but a torment. In her haunting story, The Yellow Wallpaper, Gilman reveals how enforced rest can drive a woman deeper into madness, her anxiety multiplying in the silence of confinement. Yet the rest cure is only one approach. In the same century, women's anxiety is also treated with stimulation, sometimes brutally so. Physicians apply electricity to the skin, not as Enlightenment theater but as supposed scientific necessity. Hydrotherapy emerges as another favorite. Anxious women are plunged into cold baths, blasted with jets of water, or wrapped in wet sheets, all in the name of calming their nerves. Some are rotated in chairs until they vomit, an echo of earlier Enlightenment experiments, now institutionalized within asylums. These treatments are not confined to the wealthy. They are inflicted on working-class women whose anxiety becomes visible in ways society deems disruptive. The asylum, expanding rapidly in this century, becomes the great container for female anxiety, its walls echoing with the cries of those labeled incurable. At the same time, a softer narrative coexists. The diagnosis of neurasthenia, introduced by George Beard in America, becomes the fashionable complaint of the middle and upper classes. It is said to arise from the exhaustion of modern life. The telegraph, the typewriter, the railway, the newspaper. Civilization itself is blamed for fraying the nerves. For women, neurasthenia offers a curious space. It is at once stigmatizing and legitimizing. To claim nervous illness is to declare oneself delicate, refined, sensitive to the world's pressures. It excuses women from certain domestic or social duties, yet it also marks them as fragile, incapable of full participation in the public sphere. Doctors prescribe tonics, travel, and moderation, recommending seaside holidays or spa visits as remedies for nervous exhaustion. Women flock to Brighton or the Riviera, promenading along beaches while sipping mineral waters, their anxiety temporarily reframed as leisure. But beneath the surface, contradictions multiply. The same society that insists women are too nervous for education also places them in factories, where hours of repetitive labor, deafening machines, and toxic fumes exacerbate anxiety in far harsher forms. The working-class woman cannot recline on a fainting couch. Her trembling hands are expected to continue stitching, pressing, scrubbing. If she falters, she may be dismissed as lazy or unstable, her anxiety ignored until it erupts into collapse or breakdown. When such women enter asylums, they rarely leave. Institutional records from the century are filled with women admitted for melancholia, nervousness, or hysteria, often after domestic disputes, miscarriages, or overwork. Their anxiety, stripped of sympathy, becomes evidence of madness. At the same time, the century gives rise to psychiatry as a discipline. Figures like Jean-Martin Charcot in Paris transform the anxious woman into both subject and spectacle once again. In the lecture halls of the Salpêtrière, Charcot demonstrates cases of female hysteria before rows of students and onlookers. Women convulse, faint, or freeze under his gaze, their symptoms documented in photographs and case notes. These women are studied, dissected by the eye of science, yet rarely healed. Sigmund Freud, attending Charcot's lectures, will carry these observations into his own theories of hysteria, eventually linking anxiety to unconscious conflicts rather than nerves alone. By the century's end, psychoanalysis is born, forever altering how anxiety is understood. But in its early days, it is still women who serve as the proving ground for ideas that elevate male doctors to fame while leaving female patients silenced. The 19th century also amplifies the chemical approach. Laudanum continues its reign, but morphine, chloroform, and later barbiturates begin to enter circulation. Women suffering from nerves are dosed with opiates that soothe them into docility, their anxiety chemically suppressed but never addressed. Addiction quietly spreads, hidden in respectable households where bottles of tinctures line the shelves. The link between women's anxiety and pharmaceutical dependence begins here, foreshadowing the 20th century's tranquilizers. And then there is the corset. It may not be listed in medical journals, but countless women's anxieties are tied, literally, into the laces at their backs. The tightness of Victorian fashion constricts breath, accelerates heartbeat, induces dizziness. Some fainting may be less about fragile nerves and more about constricted lungs. Yet society interprets this through its own lens, reinforcing the idea that women are naturally nervous, naturally weak. The clothing itself becomes a silent enforcer of gendered anxiety, both cause and symbol of restraint. Not all stories from this century are bleak. Some women find strength in their diagnoses, using their nerves as justification for carving out space for creativity or reform. Writers, artists, and activists channel their anxiety into output that critiques the very systems that confine them. Gilman, again, is one example. So too are women who publish memoirs of asylum life, exposing abuses and calling for reform. Their anxiety becomes both subject matter and fuel for resistance. Yet such voices are few compared to the masses, silenced within institutions or bedrooms. As the century draws to a close, you sense the weight of contradictions pressing in. Anxiety has been medicalized, pathologized, institutionalized. Women's bodies and minds have been prodded, confined, electrified, sedated. At the same time, anxiety has been romanticized, woven into the literature of sensibility, the aesthetics of fainting couches, the diagnosis of neurasthenia. It is both fashion and fate, both curse and shield. The anxious woman of the 19th century is at once patient, prisoner, and performer. She lies in her darkened bedroom on the rest cure, stares at asylum walls, strolls along seaside promenades, and dreams of something beyond the constant negotiation of fragility and strength. You leave this century amid the hiss of steam engines, the flicker of gas lamps, the rustle of corseted skirts. The world is changing faster than ever, and anxiety is both symptom and symbol of that change. For women, it remains both deeply personal and profoundly political. Their trembling hands, their restless nights, their fainting spells and suppressed cries are not merely medical curiosities. They are the pulse of an age straining under its own momentum. As the century closes and Freud begins to speak of unconscious drives, the stage is set for the 20th century, where anxiety will no longer be confined to parlors or asylums alone. It will spill into the language of psychology, the reach of pharmaceuticals, and the very fabric of modern life. But that is another story, one already stirring just beyond the lamplight. The 20th century arrives like a tremor, and with it comes the birth of an entirely new way of looking at women's anxiety. The old languages of hysteria and nerves still echo, but they are no longer enough. Factories boom, empires tremble, world wars scar the globe, and within this turbulence, anxiety becomes not only a private ailment but also a central concern of medicine, psychology, and culture. Women, as they had for centuries, remain at the forefront of this shifting narrative, not because they are listened to, but because their suffering continues to serve as the proving ground upon which theories are tested, treatments invented, and social fears projected. Sigmund Freud dominates the early decades, striding across Vienna with his cigar, declaring that hysteria is not simply nerves but a psychological symptom of repressed emotions and unconscious conflicts. For centuries, women's anxiety had been tethered to their wombs, their weaker nerves, their supposed fragility. Freud severs this cord and ties it to the mind. Suddenly, anxiety is no longer purely physical, it is psychic. Women are invited into the therapeutic space of psychoanalysis, where they lie upon couches and speak of dreams, desires, and fears. But the promise of liberation is double-edged. Freud insists that hysteria often stems from unresolved Oedipal conflicts, from repressed sexuality, from the inability to accept one's feminine role. Women who resist marriage, who bristle at motherhood, who feel stifled by patriarchy, are told that their anxiety is the result of psychological maladjustment, not systemic oppression. Their suffering is reframed as pathology rather than protest. Psychoanalysis spreads like wildfire. Across Europe and America, analysts listen to anxious women recount their symptoms, their sleeplessness, their racing hearts. Some find relief in the act of speaking. an unprecedented space where their voices matter, if only within the confines of the consulting room. Yet for others, the theories themselves become cages. Anxiety, according to Freud and his followers, is evidence of neurosis, of unconscious repression. To be anxious is to be broken, and the repair lies not in social change, but in uncovering buried desires. Meanwhile, the asylum system continues to expand in the early 20th century. Women whose anxiety spirals into visible breakdowns are institutionalized in ever-growing numbers. Treatments shift from the water therapies and rest cures of the 19th century to new, more aggressive interventions. Insulin coma therapy is introduced. Women are injected with insulin until they convulse and collapse into a coma, then revived, under the theory that the shock resets the nervous system. Electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, follows, a surge of electricity across the brain that induces seizures, wiping memory but often temporarily reducing symptoms. For anxious women, ECT becomes both salvation and terror. Some recover their calm, others lose fragments of themselves, and all endure the stigma of being subjected to such extremes. The mid-century escalates further into what one might call the mechanization of anxiety treatment. With the rise of psychopharmacology in the 1950s, women's anxiety becomes a market. Barbiturates, first prescribed widely for insomnia and tension, sweep through households, leaving behind trails of addiction and overdoses. Soon, tranquilizers emerge: Miltown, Librium, Valium. Advertisements flood magazines, depicting anxious housewives calmed by mother's little helper. A new narrative solidifies. Women's anxiety is not just an individual ailment, but a social phenomenon, and the cure lies in pills that soothe without disrupting domestic order. The cultural image of the nervous, sedated housewife becomes one of the most enduring symbols of mid-20th century anxiety. Yet within this chemical revolution lies a bitter irony. The very structures that provoke women's anxiety, confining gender roles, isolation in the suburbs, the pressure to perform endless domestic labor, are erased from the conversation. Instead, pharmaceutical companies and doctors assure women that their suffering is a matter of imbalance, to be corrected with medication. The tranquilizer industry thrives, feeding upon the quiet desperation of millions. Anxiety now is both profit and pathology. At the same time, alternative voices begin to emerge. The women's movement of the 1960s and 70s challenges the narrative that anxiety is simply an internal failing. Feminist writers argue that much of what is diagnosed as female neurosis is, in fact, the result of structural oppression. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique famously names the problem that has no name, describing the malaise of suburban housewives who, despite comfort and security, feel trapped and anxious. Anxiety is reframed not as individual weakness, but as collective symptom, evidence of a society that denies women meaningful roles beyond wife and mother. This reframing is revolutionary, though not universally embraced. The medical establishment clings tightly to its diagnoses and prescriptions. In psychiatry, the century witnesses the gradual abandonment of hysteria as a diagnosis, though its shadows remain. Anxiety disorders begin to take shape as distinct categories: generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, phobias. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, first published in 1952, codifies these categories, shifting treatment towards standardized labels. Women continue to dominate the statistics, diagnosed at higher rates than men. Their symptoms, restlessness, panic attacks, obsessive thoughts, are mapped, categorized, and treated with increasing specificity. But even as classification grows more precise, the lived experience of women with anxiety remains profoundly shaped by culture. A woman in 1930s Vienna may be told her anxiety stems from unresolved unconscious desires. A woman in 1950s New York may be handed Valium for her nerves. A woman in 1970s London may be encouraged to join a consciousness-raising group and reframe her suffering as feminist awakening. The context changes, the treatments evolve, but the underlying dynamic persists. Women's anxiety is both deeply personal and profoundly political, a mirror reflecting the anxieties of the societies they inhabit. War, too, plays its role. The world wars of the 20th century thrust women into new roles: factory work, nursing, even combat support, only to demand their return to domesticity once peace arrives. Many women suffer what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress, whether from bombings, loss of loved ones, or direct participation in wartime labor and danger. Yet their anxiety is often minimized, overshadowed by the male soldier's trauma. Shell shock becomes a recognized category for men, while women's wartime anxiety remains folded into existing diagnoses of hysteria or nerves. Their suffering is rendered secondary, even invisible. The century is also one of contradictions. While some women are silenced by tranquilizers or institutional walls, others harness the language of psychology to demand change. Memoirs, case studies, and novels pour forth, offering first-hand accounts of anxiety and its treatments. Sylvia Plath in The Bell Jar lays bare the suffocating weight of mid-century psychiatric treatment, from electroshock to the alienation of being deemed unstable. Her work, like Gilman's before her, turns personal anxiety into cultural critique, exposing the flaws of systems meant to heal. By the closing decades of the 20th century, anxiety has become both ubiquitous and normalized. The DSM-III, published in 1980, formalizes anxiety disorders as major diagnostic categories, spurring research and pharmaceutical development. Prozac and other SSRIs arrive, shifting treatment from tranquilization to chemical regulation of serotonin. Women continue to be the primary consumers of these medications, their anxiety reframed once more as neurochemical imbalance. The story circles back to biology, though now in the language of neurotransmitters rather than wandering wombs. Yet even here, culture refuses to be ignored. Advertisements for antidepressants and anxiolytics target women disproportionately, reinforcing the idea that anxiety is part of femininity itself. Popular culture echoes this association, portraying anxious women as fragile, neurotic, or unstable. At the same time, feminist scholarship pushes back, insisting that women's higher rates of diagnosis may reflect not innate fragility but systemic burdens: caretaking, unequal labor, trauma, and the relentless policing of gender roles. And so the 20th century ends with a strange duality. Anxiety is at once more understood and more medicalized than ever. Women can seek treatment without necessarily being locked in asylums. They can take pills that offer genuine relief rather than endless sedation. But they also remain ensnared in a cycle where their suffering is commodified, where their pain is both minimized and monetized, where the line between liberation and control blurs. The anxious woman of the 20th century lies on Freud's couch, shudders beneath the shock of electrodes, swallows pills with her morning coffee, marches in protest with fellow feminists, and writes poems in the silence of midnight. She embodies the contradictions of a century that promised progress yet often delivered repetition in new forms. Her anxiety is not simply hers alone. It is the echo of wars, revolutions, cultural upheavals, and scientific experiments. It is personal, yes, but also profoundly historical. As the century closes and the world tips into the digital age, a new chapter is ready to begin. Anxiety will not vanish with the millennium. It will expand, mutate, and intertwine with the technologies, economies, and cultures of the 21st century. But the echoes of Freud's couch, of Valium bottles, of feminist manifestos will remain. Women's anxiety, like the women themselves, carries history within it. To trace its course through the 20th century is to see how medicine, culture, and power entwined, and to prepare for the next evolution of this enduring human condition. You slip forward into the 21st century and the world is buzzing, literally. Phones vibrate in pockets, notifications blink, laptops hum late into the night. Anxiety, which once crept into candlelit bedrooms and whispered at the edges of quiet fields, now screams through screens. For women, the story of anxiety takes on new dimensions, no longer confined to fainting couches or Freudian couches, but embedded in algorithms, economic pressures, and the relentless glow of digital life. The early years of the millennium open with hope. Psychiatric medicine boasts new generations of drugs, SSRIs, SNRIs, even more targeted medications, marketed as safer, smarter, and more effective than the tranquilizers of mid-century. Women flock to doctors seeking relief, and prescriptions multiply. Prozac, Zoloft, Paxil, names that roll easily off tongues become household words, as ordinary as aspirin. The promise is clear. Chemical imbalances can be righted, neurotransmitters smoothed, anxiety tamed with science. For many, this is a lifeline. Panic attacks ease, sleep returns, daily functioning improves. Yet as always, there's a shadow. Side effects gnaw at quality of life, weight changes, numbness, sexual dysfunction. And beneath it all lingers the old problem. The world keeps producing anxiety faster than pills can erase it. Technology transforms not only treatments but also triggers. Social media, born as a way to connect, quickly becomes a new engine of comparison and surveillance. Women scroll endlessly, bombarded with curated images of beauty, success, and happiness. Every filtered photo whispers, "You are not enough." Anxiety is amplified, not soothed, by the endless scroll. Online communities offer support, yes. Forums where women trade coping strategies, share stories, and destigmatize mental health. But they also intensify the pressure to perform wellness itself. You can almost feel the paradox. The very platforms that promise connection breed isolation. The spaces where women seek validation deepen self-doubt. Historians still argue whether the digital age democratized mental health discourse or commodified it beyond recognition. On one hand, women now have unprecedented access to information, self-help resources, and teletherapy. Barriers of geography crumble. Someone in a rural village can log into therapy with a counselor across the world. On the other hand, the rise of wellness industries churns out quick fixes, essential oils, mindfulness apps, overpriced supplements, marketed directly to anxious women. Relief becomes another product, anxiety another market niche. The 21st century also brings with it the language of empowerment. Campaigns declare it's okay not to be okay. Celebrities speak openly about their panic attacks, their struggles with depression, their need for therapy. The stigma, once suffocating, loosens. Yet the gender gap persists. Women are still diagnosed with anxiety disorders at nearly twice the rate of men. Are they more vulnerable or simply more scrutinized? Scholars debate, pointing to biological predispositions, hormonal influences, but also to the heavier social loads women carry. Unpaid caregiving, wage inequality, the double burden of work and home. Anxiety in this century is less likely to be dismissed as witchcraft or hysteria, but it remains deeply entangled with systemic imbalance. And then comes the storm of global crises. The 2008 financial crash leaves families reeling, with women often shouldering the emotional fallout. The COVID-19 pandemic intensifies everything: isolation, economic precarity, health fears. Anxiety spikes worldwide, and women, disproportionately frontline workers, caregivers, and mothers, bear the brunt. You can almost hear the muffled cries behind closed doors. Women logging into Zoom meetings while juggling children, aging parents, and their own unraveling nerves. Mental health becomes not just personal but political, a barometer of systemic fragility. Quirky treatments resurface too, echoing history's strange cycles. Virtual reality exposure therapy lets women face phobias in simulated environments. Light boxes promise to banish seasonal gloom. Digital detox retreats sell the chance to escape screens, much like 17th century retreats to rural estates. The parallels shimmer. You've seen women isolated for healing before, only now they pay thousands for Wi-Fi free sanctuaries with kombucha on tap. the theater of treatment persists, dressed in modern branding. Yet genuine progress flickers through. Therapies diversify: cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness-based stress reduction, acceptance and commitment therapy. Women learn to name intrusive thoughts, to breathe through panic, to reclaim agency in ways their foremothers could not. Support networks flourish online, where shared hashtags create solidarity rather than stigma. Anxiety, once weaponized against women, becomes a rallying point for collective care. But the paradox remains. Anxiety is at once medicalized and normalized, commodified and resisted. Women are encouraged to speak their truth, but also to manage their symptoms quietly so they can keep functioning in systems stacked against them. A woman today may sip chamomile tea recommended by an influencer, meditate with an app, then take her SSRI before logging into a job where burnout is inevitable. She is at once freer and more trapped, her anxiety both validated and exploited. You pause here in the 21st century and feel the hum of anxious energy all around. It buzzes in group chats, pulses through work emails, flares in headlines about climate collapse and political unrest. Women carry these burdens heavily, their anxiety no longer dismissed as hysteria, but still rarely treated at its root. And you realize the story is unfinished. The anxious woman of today is both heir to centuries of misdiagnosis and mistreatment, and pioneer of new ways to understand and survive. You drift now beyond the Euro-American narrative, letting the hum of global voices rise around you. For centuries, the dominant story of women's anxiety has been told from Western halls, monasteries, salons, asylums, clinics. But in the 21st century, the lens widens. Anxiety is not, after all, the sole inheritance of noblewomen in lace or suburban housewives clutching pills. It pulses in the crowded markets of Lagos, in the quiet courtyards of Lahore, in the high-rises of Sao Paulo. And while the vocabulary shifts, the essence remains. Women everywhere negotiate anxiety through the tangled threads of culture, medicine, and power. In many societies of the global South, anxiety has long been woven into spiritual traditions. A woman trembling in a village in South Asia may still be said to suffer from possession or the evil eye. Families call on faith healers, who murmur prayers, burn incense, and tie protective amulets around wrists. The treatment is communal, filled with ritual and presence, unlike the clinical sterility of Western hospitals. Yet the effect can cut two ways. Sometimes the ritual comforts, reminding the woman that she is held by her community. Other times it deepens stigma, branding her as tainted or morally weak. Historians still argue whether these practices offered genuine spaces of care or simply reinforced patriarchal control. Move to West Africa, and you hear of Sankofa, a Ghanaian concept of reaching back to move forward. Women's anxiety here often finds explanation not in neurotransmitters but in ruptures of lineage, in the forgetting of ancestors, in social disconnection. Healers prescribe storytelling, drumming, or dance to realign the spirit. To Western ears, this may sound quaint, even exotic, but imagine the embodied relief of pounding rhythms under your feet, of voices rising with yours in song. Anxiety here is not hidden behind closed therapy doors but released in the open air, where it belongs to everyone. Meanwhile, global psychiatry attempts to plant its flag. Aid organizations, NGOs, and pharmaceutical companies enter villages and cities, introducing Western diagnoses and medications. A woman once treated with herbal infusions or spirit rituals now finds herself prescribed fluoxetine or benzodiazepines. For some, this is life-saving, a sudden access to treatments long withheld. For others, it feels like cultural erasure, a flattening of rich traditions into clinical checklists. The debate still smolders. Is this progress or a new form of colonial imposition, another way the global North dictates how the global South should understand its own suffering? Consider Latin America. Here, anxiety has a distinctive cultural flavor, often described through nervios, a condition blending trembling, headaches, and emotional distress. Women speak of attacks de nervios, sudden episodes of uncontrollable crying or screaming, usually in response to family conflict. Doctors trained in Western psychiatry may diagnose panic disorder, but within communities, nervios carries layers of meaning: a social cry, a performance of suffering, a way to demand care in environments where women's voices might otherwise be ignored. To dismiss it as mere symptom is to miss its cultural logic. Anxiety, once again, proves itself both biological and profoundly social. In the Middle East, the story bends again. Women navigating war, displacement, and political upheaval often experience anxiety that outsiders label post-traumatic stress. Yet within communities, suffering may be voiced through poetry, lament, or religious devotion rather than clinical language. A woman weeping in a refugee camp may whisper that her heart is heavy, that God alone knows her sorrow. She may never use the word anxiety, but the sleepless nights, the palpitations, the dread, these are as real as any Western diagnosis. Relief may come not from pills but from shared prayer, from reciting familiar verses, from the simple solidarity of other women enduring the same. Quirky details pepper this global map. In parts of rural China, anxious women have been advised to drink teas brewed from chrysanthemum or jujube seeds, remedies traced back to ancient texts. In South American shamanic traditions, women seeking calm may participate in ceremonies with ayahuasca, guided by community and ritual. In Kenya, elders once recommended chewing certain tree bark said to cool the nerves. None of these are guaranteed cures, but they remind you that the human urge to soothe anxiety takes countless forms, each rooted in culture and place. And yet, globalization itself breeds new anxieties. The same smartphones buzzing in New York hum just as loudly in Nairobi. Social media's pressures cross oceans, carrying ideals of thinness, beauty, and success into every corner. A young woman in Manila scrolling Instagram may feel the same pit of inadequacy as her counterpart in Paris. The anxiety is global, but the tools for coping are unevenly distributed. Wealth buys therapy apps, yoga retreats, medication. Poverty often leaves only community, prayer, or silence. You notice, too, the persistence of double standards. In affluent spaces, a woman's anxiety may be reframed as a mental health challenge deserving of compassion. In poorer settings, the same anxiety may be condemned as laziness or instability. A woman in Rio who cannot work because of panic is often treated differently from a woman in London who receives a medical leave note. Stigma and privilege still shape whose anxiety is heard and whose is punished. The 21st century Global South teaches you one more truth. Women's anxiety is never only about nerves or neurotransmitters. It is about hunger, war, climate change, migration, economic precarity. It is about the social fabric tearing under strain. A Bangladeshi garment worker fainting from panic in a crowded factory does not need psychoanalysis. She needs safe labor conditions. A Syrian mother awake all night worrying about her children's future does not need mindfulness apps. She needs stability and safety. Anxiety here is a symptom of systemic violence as much as individual vulnerability. And yet, despite it all, resilience shines through. Women organize support circles, create informal networks, reinvent traditions. They blend old and new, combining prayer with counseling, herbal teas with SSRIs, ancestral rituals with online forums. Anxiety is not erased, but it is held, carried together. The anxious woman of the Global South is no passive patient. She is a weaver, stitching fragments of tradition and modernity into a fabric strong enough to hold her community. As you drift from these crowded streets and quiet villages back into the broader flow of history, you realize how narrow the Western lens has often been. Women's anxiety is not one story but many, not one diagnosis but 1,000 expressions. The digital age amplifies voices across continents, reminding you that to understand women's anxiety is to listen widely, beyond borders, beyond categories. Now you step into the 21st century's glowing screen light, where the hum of technology merges with the pulse of feminist critique, and women's anxiety takes on forms unimagined by physicians of earlier ages. The digital world is both balm and blade, refuge and trap. For every online community offering solidarity, there is an algorithm amplifying fear. Anxiety, once treated with amulets, leeches, or laudanum, now scrolls endlessly through feeds, refreshes on timelines, multiplies in notification chimes. And as it does, women confront not only the old weight of patriarchy, but also new pressures of visibility, perfection, and constant comparison. Consider first the sheer speed. A medieval woman's worries might spread no further than her village, her family, her parish. Today, an anxious woman carries the whole world in her pocket. Every war, every climate disaster, every political crisis appears instantly before her eyes. The nervous system, tuned by evolution to threats in the immediate environment, reels under a barrage of global catastrophe. Psychologists call it doom scrolling. Women call it lying awake at 3 a.m., heart racing, unable to switch off. The new treatment manuals describe it as information overload. But the sensation is familiar. The same trembling, the same breathlessness, the same sleepless nights that women in centuries past described under different names. And yet the digital realm offers lifelines. Women who once suffered in silence now find communities online, forums, support groups, hashtags where they can speak without shame. A woman in Tehran tweets about panic attacks and receives replies from strangers in Toronto, Delhi, and Nairobi. A teenager in Warsaw posts a video about her first anxiety attack, and millions nod in recognition. What was once unspeakable becomes visible, even celebrated, as part of the collective fight to destigmatize mental health. In this sense, the internet functions like the communal healing rituals of earlier societies, a shared performance of suffering that makes the unbearable bearable. But with visibility comes surveillance. Employers monitor posts, families police daughters' online lives, trolls target women who share too openly. Anxiety is magnified not just by personal fears, but by the threat of public shamming. Women who write about mental health online may be branded as unstable, unfit, or attention-seeking. The old suspicion of hysteria resurfaces in digital form, rebranded as gaslighting, trolling, or cyber harassment. The stage is larger, the consequences harsher. Overlay this with the economics of wellness culture. On one side, you find genuine efforts to offer therapy apps, telehealth sessions, mindfulness platforms. On the other, a billion-dollar industry markets anxiety as a consumer identity. Crystals, supplements, yoga mats, weighted blankets, productivity planners, all promise calm at a price. Women are once again positioned as both sufferers and consumers, their pain transformed into profit. Critics point out the irony. Centuries ago, women's anxiety was dismissed as imaginary, while now it is monetized as endlessly treatable. Either way, the structure of power ensures that women rarely own the terms of their care. Yet feminism reshapes the conversation. From academic critiques to grassroots activism, women insist that anxiety is not merely an individual disorder but a political condition. They argue that living under constant threat, of violence, of wage inequality, of reproductive control, naturally produces anxiety. To diagnose the symptom without addressing its causes is to miss the point. Anxiety is no longer hidden, no longer trivialized. It is brandished as evidence of injustice. Still, this shift is uneven. In privileged spaces, therapy and medication are accessible, even fashionable. In less resourced contexts, stigma and silence remain. A woman in California may proudly share her diagnosis as part of her identity. A woman in rural Pakistan may be beaten or exorcised for expressing similar symptoms. The global digital age collapses these realities together on the same platforms, making disparities harder to ignore. Anxiety, then, becomes both a shared experience and a measure of inequality. Think, too, of generational layers. Older women who grew up when mental health was taboo navigate shame as well as symptom. Younger women raised in online cultures of disclosure may speak freely but feel crushed by comparison. For some, the public narrative of empowerment rings hollow against their private dread. For others, it is liberating, proof that they are not alone. The interplay of generations mirrors earlier histories. Just as 17th century noblewomen performed fragility while peasants bore anxiety silently, so too today's divides show how class, culture, and age determine what is permissible to express. And through all this, the body keeps score. Panic attacks still constrict throats, insomnia still hollows eyes, stomachs still knot with dread. Technology, feminism, global awareness, none erase the physiological reality. What changes is the framing, the hashtags, the diagnoses, the consumer products, the critiques. A woman's shaking hands might once have been tied to the moon, then to the womb, then to the nerves, and now to trauma or burnout. The explanations differ, but the tremor remains constant. The digital age has democratized discourse around women's anxiety, allowing solidarity across borders and identities. Yet it has also amplified pressures, monetized suffering, and created new forms of exposure. Feminism has transformed anxiety into a political signal, demanding systemic change rather than private shame. Yet stigma, inequality, and misunderstanding persist, echoing older histories in new guises. The anxious woman of the 21st century sits before a glowing screen, scrolling, typing, connecting. She is not alone. Millions sit with her, sharing symptoms and survival. She is stronger for being heard, yet more vulnerable for being seen. She inherits centuries of misdiagnosis, of ritual and remedy, of dismissal and commodification. She carries them into a future still uncertain, where anxiety remains both curse and catalyst, both private torment and collective demand. And as she breathes through another wave, you sense that the story is not finished. One more section remains, to gather these threads into a reflection on what history has taught, and what women's anxiety might yet mean in the centuries to come. You have now walked the long corridors of history, from the whispered fears of ancient temples to the scroll-lit glow of the digital age. At each turn, women's anxiety appeared under a new mask, sometimes a crime, sometimes a weakness, sometimes a luxury, sometimes a disorder to be branded, sold, or silenced. And yet, as you pause here, you realize something astonishing. Despite centuries of shifting language and treatment, the core experience has remained remarkably steady. The flutter in the chest, the sleepless nights, the sense of dread without a clear object, these threads run unbroken through time, binding together women who never knew each other, who lived worlds apart, yet who shared this intimate affliction. Think of how it began. In ancient worlds where the gods and spirits were blamed for every tremor of the soul, anxiety was not yet called by name, but it was there, hidden in rituals of purification, in offerings left on temple altars, in the heavy silence of women who dared not speak their unrest. Move forward and you see the medieval witch trials, where anxious gestures could condemn a woman to the stake. Anxiety was no longer invisible, it was dangerous. What was once an illness became evidence of sorcery, a crime punished with death. Then through the Renaissance, through the 17th century, through Enlightenment science and Victorian asylum walls, the story repeats with variations. Treatments evolve, but rarely with gentleness. Bloodletting, blistering agents, isolation cures, electroshock, and opiates, all aim to manage women's anxiety without ever listening to it. Each age promised progress, yet progress often meant new forms of containment. Women were told their trembling was weakness, their panic mere hysteria, their exhaustion a flaw in nerves, womb, or willpower. Even when care was cloaked in velvet, even when chocolate or pearls were offered as medicine, control remained the true prescription. But alongside this story of repression, another tale quietly unfolded. Women found ways to use their anxiety as language, as signal, as resistance. A fainting spell at court might excuse a woman from an unwanted obligation. A melancholic retreat might grant space for thought. A nervous crisis might reveal the unspoken pressures of society itself. At times, Women's suffering became a mirror in which culture caught its own reflection, forced to see that the unease of individuals often echoed the instability of the collective. Wars, famines, revolutions, each left its imprint on women's nerves, and women's nerves, in turn, spoke truths about those times. Now in the present, anxiety is framed less as a curse and more as a condition. There are diagnoses, therapies, medications, and support networks. There is solidarity, there is speech, there is even pride in claiming the word. Yet the paradox persists. Stigma shadows progress, profit shadows care, inequality shadows solidarity. To say I have anxiety today is at once to name a common human struggle and to step into a contested space of identity, politics, and commerce. So where does the story go from here? The answer is unfinished, as it has always been. Perhaps in centuries to come, people will look back at our era with the same mix of pity and wonder we feel toward the leech jars and asylum wards of earlier ages. They may ask, why did they treat anxiety as something to be cured, rather than as something to be understood? Why did they force women to adapt to societies built on strain, rather than reshaping societies to honor human limits? Why did they sell serenity instead of building justice? And perhaps they will recognize, too, the courage of those who spoke, who resisted, who reframed their anxiety not as shame but as signal. The young activists who declared climate dread a rational response, the survivors who turned private terror into collective testimony, the everyday women who refused to apologize for their racing hearts and restless nights. These may be remembered as the ones who gave anxiety a new role in history, transforming it from silence into speech, from weakness into witness. As you close this long journey, one image lingers, a line of women across centuries, hands trembling but joined. Some are veiled, some crowned, some shackled, some scrolling on glowing screens. They cannot speak to each other, but their bodies speak the same language. Their anxiety is not simply personal. It is historical, political, cultural. It is not only what they endure, but also what they reveal. And so the lesson is this. Women's anxiety is not a footnote in history. It is a record of history itself, inscribed in the body when words were forbidden, expressed in sighs when speech was silenced, shouted in hashtags when silence broke. To understand it is to understand the world that produced it. To honor it is to honor not only suffering, but resilience. You walk away from these centuries knowing that the anxious woman is not merely a patient, not merely a victim, but also a historian, her nerves archiving truths that official records ignored. Her story is unfinished, as yours is, but it continues as long as there are women who breathe, tremble, endure, and insist on being heard. The journey slows now, like the last notes of a lullaby drifting into the night. You've traveled through centuries of shadows and candlelight, through voices trembling in silence and bodies burdened by treatments that rarely healed. And here you are, safe, watching the threads connect, centuries unraveling into the present, one long story of endurance stitched into time. Let your shoulders drop for a moment. Breathe out the weight of those heavy histories, the asylums and courtrooms, the fainting couches and electroshock chairs. They belong to another world, another age, yet somehow they echo in the present. That echo can be unsettling, but it can also be grounding. A reminder that what you feel is not isolated, not strange, not new. It belongs to a lineage of human struggle, of women who came before you, who carried similar storms inside their chests. Imagine them now, their hands reaching across centuries, offering quiet reassurance. You are not alone. The racing thoughts, the restless nights, the sudden surges of fear, they have been felt before. And just as history carried those women forward, it carries you too. So let the noise soften. Let the images fade into a calm horizon. What remains is not the chaos of centuries, but the resilience that outlived them. The whispered strength in each anxious breath, the persistence to keep moving forward, even when the ground felt unsteady. As your eyes grow heavy, picture that long line of women again, some with veils, some with crowns, some with nothing at all, yet all still here in memory and spirit standing beside you. Their presence is steady, like a hand on your shoulder. You can rest now. The story continues, but tonight it can wait. Sweet dreams.